Welcome. My name is Naveed Hanif, Director of the UN Financing for Sustainable Development Office. We are delighted to launch these UN Tax Talks, our latest initiative to support developing countries in strengthening their capacities for financing sustainable development. We are aware that without a stronger international response to the COVID-19 pandemic, we, the world risks the devastations of a lost decade of development in developing countries. Ladies and gentlemen, the UN tax talks feature renowned experts who summarize the latest international tax debates, provide guidance on tax policy alternatives, and do all that with special focus on the policy environment, needs, and priorities of developing countries. Heading this first short video of the series is Ms. Anita Kapur, distinguished international tax expert and former chairperson of the Central Board of Direct Taxes. Anita also served as vice chairperson of the UN Tax Committee from 2009 to 2013. Her talk focuses on the future of tax incentives. The pandemic and our desire to build back better and fairer has opened up discourse and possibilities on several tax issues, including to finally advance a global corporate minimum tax. If done right, this could be a game changer in reducing harmful tax competition. Whatever your views on such tax, you would agree that if implemented, a global minimum tax would have an impact on available tax incentives. Anita sheds light on the current international discussions and issues and options for developing countries in their quest to attract the right sort of investment for sustainable development, which is designed to provide resources for their national sustainable development priorities. We hope this short video informs and assists your work, and we would welcome your feedback. Now, let's hear from Ms. Anita Kapur on the future of tax incentives. Thank you.
Today, I'm going to share with you my thoughts regard to tax incentives, particularly in the context of Pillar 2 proposals. These views are personal and do not reflect the views of my government or of my country. Tax incentives proceed on the basic assumption that certain economically and socially relevant activities would not happen without the tax subsidy in the form of tax incentives. These incentives are sometimes also for country-specific needs. Like in India, we have incentives to encourage cooperative form. These could also be to ensure that regional disparities do not persist. So there are various reasons for which the countries could adopt in their tax codes or in the informal processes tax incentives. And it is also seen in some countries that informal sector moves to formal sector because of these incentives, and hard to tax segment of the tax base actually becomes compliant, making the enforcement and compliance strategies of the government much more focused and easy to implement. All this is good about tax incentives. But despite that, there is a strong movement against the tax incentives. The reason is that the ill effect of tax incentives have also been documented in various studies. The incentives make the tax system opaque and prone to litigation. It also, in a way, distorts the resource allocation because capital and labor moves driven not by the market forces but by the tax incentives. Studies show that tax incentives create their own vested interests. There is corruption. There is also extensive abuse of these incentives by profit shifting. We have seen in large number of cases where when tax incentives are withdrawn, the post-tax income suddenly shows a huge dip, not because the tax has been imposed, but because the pre-tax income itself shows a sudden decline. Then, in Indian context, we had seen cases where we had given some tax breaks for exports, and the income generated from domestic activities was being shown as export proceeds, with the result that we had revenue loss without actually creating any export worthy material. There are also studies to indicate that in most of the cases, investment follows not because of tax incentives, but because of certain other factors. These are where there is economic and political stability, the laws are clear, the judiciary is independent, IPRs, other property rights, contractual rights get honored, there is a huge market, there is skilled labor available, there is good infrastructure. All these are the actual and very real pushes for investment. So, in some cases, the tax incentives may actually be redundant because the investment would have come without these incentives. Further, the investment may just be substitution for other investment. It may actually not generate new jobs. It may substitute jobs. It may crowd out some kinds of investment which would have yielded much better taxes. Then they also create a huge compliance burden for the taxpayers as also a burden for the administrators to see that these incentives do not get abused. In these circumstances, uh, some analysis of incentives in African countries has shown that they were ineffective and inefficient, while tax incentives have also been shown to be great success where the domestic industries improved, the exports improved, and the countries made a quantum leap in their development. Sometimes the tax incentives can actually result only in exporting of taxes. The residence country, which is taxing the income on the worldwide basis, would actually levy taxes on this foreign sourced income too. Therefore, there was a provision of tax sparing adopted in large number of treaties between developed and developing countries, where the developed countries conceded that the taxes on the income subject to incentive will be spared. Tax incentives can take different forms. These could be profit linked or these could be investment linked. There have been incentives in the form of preferential tax rate on profits, specific zones to encourage certain activities, immediate expending of capital or accelerated depreciation, investment allowances, investment credits. But the jury at least is convinced that investment based incentives are better and less prone to exploitation than the profit linked incentives. If a project is going to make profits, then there is a supposition that it would have made profits even without the tax break. But that may not really be true about mobile activities like IPRs or mobile or footloose capital, which moves uh, even if there is a marginal difference in profits, or which is expecting super profits and the tax rate can make some difference in what they get as economic rent. Still, at least there is a consensus that whatever tax incentives are given, they should be in the form of provisions in the tax code which are clear, which are transparent, and should generally be time bound and predictable. Now, let me come to Pillar 2 and its impact on tax incentives, particularly for the developing countries. Pillar 2 is going to set global rules which would entitle a resident country to tax income which is not taxed by the source country or which is taxed at a rate lower than the minimum taxation rate. Now, the minimum taxation rate has still not been agreed upon. There's a debate about this, but if you ask my personal opinion, it will not be more than 15%. So, the income which does not suffer tax or which suffers tax at less than whatever is the rate agreed as minimum taxation rate can be subjected to tax by the residence country. And there are also going to be rules regarding the deductibility of payments which are base eroding payments between the related parties. So, what you get is much beyond what was covered by the tax sparing and the earlier treaties. These rules will apply not only in regard to income of the permanent establishment, that is the direct income, these will also apply in regard to the income of the controlled foreign corporations. Now, why is the inclusive framework targeting the incentives? Why do they consider incentives as evil? One of the early documents in regard to Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 articulated that the proposals of Pillar 2 would take away the pressure from the government to give tax incentives which are prone to abuse, which are inefficient, that this would also remove one of the pushes for race to bottom, and this will reduce the differences in the effective tax rate between the countries, with the result that capital and labor would move inspired by the efficiency, inspired by the productivity, with the result that global productivity would improve. There is also an argument that this will bring down the compliance cost, this will bring down the administrative cost. The governments don't have to focus too much on enforcing proper implementation of the incentive provisions, so they'll have resources freed. Plus, when these incentives go away, governments will have to think of strategies to promote foreign investments if they want through better mechanisms. If they want their country to be an attractive investment destination, they'll have to look at other options which may be better for the country or the jurisdiction as a whole. There was a lot of concern about R&D, and some documents in regard to the impact of Pillar 2 proposals suggest that R&D basically has expenditure in the nature of capital expenditure for acquisition of assets or labor costs. So, skilled manpower cost can be addressed through non-corporate related incentives. Those could be in the form of incentives structured towards payroll taxes or towards social security contributions. As regard the capital costs, accelerated depreciation and immediate expensing could be two options available. The Pillar 2 blueprint document acknowledges that accelerated depreciation as also immediate expensing of capital costs actually creates timing differences, because what you deduct immediately, you won't be able to deduct in future in the form of depreciation, and that it's a zero sum games at some stage. And the income inclusion rules for other temporary differences as a mechanism of creating credits, etc. So, if you do not want the effect of accelerated depreciation or immediate expending to be neutralized, then you have to work out a system of retaining these advantages which are temporary in nature. And the blueprint does suggest that model in regard to this would be worked out, which should be simple, easy to implement. But there are still issues which can complicate this matter, like for one country, a rate of 20% on general machinery may be accelerated depreciation, and the other country in its domestic law considers that 10% is the normal rate. These are the issues which still need to be thrashed out, but at least the blueprint does acknowledge that this is in the nature of temporary difference, which may need a separate treatment or a treatment different from the other tax incentives. The countries which or the jurisdictions which want to keep some incentives have some openings even within the pillar 2. One, like I said, on this depreciation issue. Other is the threshold which is currently being suggested for application of the global rules. The threshold is the same as for country by country reporting, that is 750 million euros. And as per the estimates of OECD, about 85 to 90% of the multinational enterprises will be out of the ambit of application of the global rules. So, if there are MNEs which can, because of the incentives being offered by a particular jurisdiction, and these MNCs are with the aggregate turnover below the threshold and are willing to invest in a country based on the incentives which are being offered, then those incentives can still continue. The second option is that many of the developing and low income countries have a tax rate which is higher than the minimum tax rate which is currently being debated. Like I said, in my understanding, it will not be more than 15%. And if the tax rate of a country or a jurisdiction is higher than 15%, they can still offer preferential tax rates which will be lower than their own effective tax rates but higher than the minimum tax rate, and structure their incentives accordingly. The third option, get a WTO kind of exemption where you seek for the countries which figure in the Annexure 7 of the WTO regime, where special differentiation and special privileges have been granted. And if these countries which are in Annexure 7 can ask that the income generated within their countries should not be subject to IIR rules. The issues are clear. The strategies that the countries or the jurisdictions need to adopt will have to be tailored to their own particular needs. Pillar 2 seems to suggest that incentives are evil. I don't totally agree with that, because I think incentives have a purpose, and if they are properly, clearly structured, have a definite sunset clause, are fairly administered, then they do serve some purpose. A country as a sovereign power has a right to structure its own tax system the way it feels it best serves its own interests. But in a global environment, sometimes compromises need to be made. Thank you.